25,000 steel blades, 100 warships, and one single goal: to erase the world's greatest shrine from the map. On August 11, 997, Al-Mansur didn't just conquer a city, he snapped the spine of an entire civilization in a matter of hours. While 500 noble knights were transformed into livestock, harnessed to the bells of their own cathedral, 200 kilograms of pure gold were already melting into the pockets of the invaders. 800 miles of humiliation, 1,000 destroyed churches, and one order that silenced Europe for 200 years. This wasn't a war, it was a surgical operation to extract a faith. What the survivors witnessed changed history forever, and the world has never seen a more massive or bloody retribution. The heavy iron gates of Viseu did not just break. They disintegrated under the rhythmic, bone-shaking pounding of the Andalusian rams. 11 August 997 began not with the sun, but with a rain of naphtha and fire that turned the morning sky into a bruised purple canopy of smoke. Al-Mansur did not believe in long sieges or diplomatic pleas. He believed in the crushing weight of momentum. As the central timber of the main gate finally splintered, a wall of dust surged outward, and through it came the vanguard. These were not mere soldiers. They were the victorious by Allah, a tidal wave of scorched steel and white turbans, moving with a synchronized lethality that silenced the city's bells in mid-toll. The air in the narrow streets instantly became a soup of grit, sweat, and the metallic tang of fresh blood. There was no time for the defenders to form a line. The Christian garrison, still buckling their breastplates, met the tip of the Moorish spear in the very corridors of their barracks. Al-Mansur sat atop his dark stallion on a ridge overlooking the northern wall, his silhouette a motionless shadow against the chaos. He did not need to shout orders. His generals knew the rhythm of the purge. To his left, the heavy cavalry, the elite Berber riders, waited for the signal to sweep the perimeter. To his right, the messengers stood ready to gallop toward Setúbal, where the fleet was already tasting the salt of the Atlantic. Viseu was the first domino, a vital logistical hub that had to be leveled to ensure no threat remained at the rear of the Grand March. The strategy was surgical. While the infantry cleared the plazas, the engineers focused on the fortifications. They didn't just capture the walls, they unmade them. Stone by stone, the pride of the local count was being reduced to a gravel path for the Caliphate's ambitions. Every 10 minutes, a new section of the city fell into shadow as the fires spread, driven by a dry summer wind that seemed to favor the invaders. A young knight, barely 19 years old, rallied 20 men near the central fountain, his sword shaking but his eyes fixed on the breach. He shouted a prayer, a desperate plea for a miracle, but the sound was swallowed by the rhythmic chanting of the advancing thousands. The Moorish archers appeared on the rooftops like ghosts, their composite bows clicking in unison. A single volley of blackened arrows erased the knight's small circle of resistance before they could even bridge the distance. It wasn't a battle, it was a harvest. There were no long descriptions of the architecture or the beauty of the cathedral, only the cold, hard reality of iron meeting bone. The speed of the takeover was designed to paralyze the surrounding territories. By the time the neighboring lords heard the screams of Viseu, there would be no Viseu left to save. The looting was not chaotic. It was an organized extraction of wealth and spirit. While the soldiers secured the perimeter, special units moved directly to the treasuries and the granaries. Every 2 minutes, a wagon loaded with silver or grain was funneled out of the southern gate, heading back toward the supply lines. Al-Mansur watched the efficiency with a cold, calculated satisfaction. He knew that a campaign of this magnitude required more than just courage. It required the calories of the enemy. The horses of the Caliphate were eating the hay of the Christians before the fires had even reached the stables. The dynamic of the conquest was shifting from a localized raid to a continental catastrophe. The local resistance was being systematically hunted through the cellars and alleyways, the sound of boots on cobblestones echoing like the ticking of a doomsday clock. As the sun reached its zenith, the heat in the city became unbearable. The smoke from the burning storehouses rose in a straight black pillar that could be seen for 30 miles. miles. It was a signal to the entire Iberian Peninsula. The Lion of Cordoba was no longer content with borders. He was coming for the heart. In the ruins of the governor's palace, the commanders of the infantry units reported the total collapse of the inner ring. Viseu had ceased to exist as a military entity in less than 4 hours. There was no room for mercy in this itinerary. The orders were to move before the ashes cooled. The transition from the slaughter to the march was seamless. The soldiers didn't rest. They wiped their blades, drank from the looted wells, and fell back into their ranks. The final surge of the first phase occurred when Al-Mansur finally descended from the ridge. He rode through the broken gate, his horse stepping over the debris of a fallen civilization without breaking stride. He didn't look at the corpses or the weeping captives. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, toward the coast. The cavalry was already peeling away, a 5,000-man force of Berber horsemen moving like a sandstorm toward the north. Behind them, the ruins of Viseu groaned as the main towers were brought down by sappers. The psychological impact was a weapon as sharp as any scimitar. The survivors were intentionally left with just enough life to carry the news of the horror to the next town. Fear was the vanguard that traveled faster than the fastest horse. Every street was a corridor of tactical execution. The archers maintained a 360-degree overwatch from the remaining high points, ensuring that not a single Christian scout could escape the perimeter to warn the inland forts. The coordination between the different wings of the army was flawless, a testament to Al-Mansur's years of iron-fisted reform. As the infantry finished the primary sweep, the heavy baggage train began to move, fueled by the fresh horses seized from the city's pens. There was no dialogue, no philosophical debate about the morality of the war. There was only the objective. The logistical machine of the Cordoba Caliphate was now fully lubricated with the spoils of the first conquest. The transition to the next stage of the nightmare was already in motion. As the fires in Viseu reached their peak, Al-Mansur received a rider from the south. The news was exactly what he expected. The fleet had cleared the docks. The sea was ours. The pincer movement was no longer a plan on a map. It was a living, breathing monster devouring the geography of the north. The Christian world was still mourning Viseu, unaware that the real blow was coming from the Atlantic waves. The pace intensified. The units reorganized into their marching columns, the sound of 2,000 boots hitting the earth in a rhythmic thud that vibrated through the very bedrock of the province. The sky began to darken, not from the evening, but from the sheer volume of soot hanging in the atmosphere. The column stretched for miles, a glittering serpent of mail and silk winding through the rugged terrain. They weren't just an army, they were a mobile state, carrying their laws and their vengeance with them. The scouts at the front reported that the path to the coast was clear of any significant resistance. The terror of Viseu had done its job. The local villages were ghost towns, the inhabitants having fled into the deep woods at the sight of the black smoke. This lack of friction only allowed Al-Mansur to push his men harder. As the first part of this campaign drew to its violent close, the focus shifted from the smoking ruins of the inland to the salty air of the ports. The land raid had been the distraction and the foundation. Now, the true scale of the humiliation was about to be revealed. The infantry units, hardened by the morning's bloodletting, turned their faces toward the coast. They didn't know the name of their final destination yet, but they knew the scent of victory. The horizon was no longer a limit, it was an invitation. 11th August was only halfway through, and the greatest atrocity of the century was just gaining its full, terrifying momentum as the first ships appeared on the misty horizon near Oporto. The Atlantic was no longer a barrier, it was a weapon. While Viseu was still a pillar of smoke, Al-Mansur's maritime strategy ignited. From the docks of Setúbal, a massive fleet of 100 warships lunged into the northern currents. This was the masterstroke, bypassing the treacherous mountain passes by shifting the weight of the war to the waves. Thousands of infantrymen, hardened by the sun of Cordoba, crammed onto the decks. They didn't speak, they sharpened steel. The rhythmic thud of oars against the Atlantic swell was the heartbeat of a coming disaster. By the time the lookouts at Oporto spotted the first Andalusian sails through the morning mist, it was already too late. The sea had delivered a wolf at their throats. The landing at Oporto was not a maneuver, it was a collision. The ships didn't wait for the tide. wide. They rammed the piers. Before the ropes were tied, the victorious by Allah were in the water, shields locked, pushing through the surf. The Christian defenders, expecting a land raid, found themselves fighting a marine nightmare. Arrows hissed from the decks of the ships, clearing the quays with surgical precision. Every 2 minutes, a new wave of soldiers hit the shore. The harbor turned into a slaughterhouse, where the scent of salt was quickly replaced by the heavy metallic tang of blood. The cobblestones grew slick, not with rain, but with the remains of a garrison that had no time to pray. Al-Mansur had planned for total paralysis. As the infantry secured the docks, the transport ships began vomiting out the heavy engines of war. Ballistae and disassembled catapults were hauled onto the stone quays by specialized units. The speed was terrifying. While the townspeople fled toward the cathedral, the Moorish engineers were already turning the port into a fortress. There were no long descriptions of the city's beauty, only the tactical reality of its collapse. The pincer was closing. The infantry was the anvil, and from the south, the dust of the cavalry announced the arrival of the hammer. The two forces, separated by hundreds of miles just days before, were merging into a single, unstoppable machine of destruction. By midday, Oporto was a staging ground. The logistics were flawless. Every barrel of grain and crate of dried fish was seized and catalogued. Al-Mansur's army didn't just conquer, they consumed. The horses of the Caliphate were soon eating from the city's own granaries, while the fires were still being lit. The resistance in the upper districts was systematically liquidated. Crossbowmen took the high ground, turning every window into a sniper's nest. The defense was not just broken, it was erased. The coordination between the sea-borne units and the land vanguard was a level of warfare the northern kings had never witnessed and could not comprehend. The sun began to bake the carnage on the docks, creating a thick, suffocating air. The final stand in the central plaza lasted less than 15 minutes. A group of knights tried a desperate charge, but they were cut down by a coordinated volley before their horses could reach full gallop. Efficiency was the only law. The citadel fell shortly after, its gates shattered by the very same rams that had leveled Viseu. Al-Mansur didn't even dismount to accept the keys to the city. He merely pointed his sword north, toward the mountains of Galicia. The message was clear. Oporto was just a supply stop on the road to a much greater desecration. The transition from the sea to the land was complete. The pincer had snapped shut, trapping the heart of the Christian resistance in its jaws. As the last of the ships unloaded, the entire army began to pivot. The infantry and cavalry formed into a singular glittering serpent of steel, ready to strike deeper into the Holy Lands. The psychological blow was absolute. The survivors were left with a vision of a fleet that could appear anywhere and an army that never slept. The road to Santiago was now open, and the only thing standing in the way was a terrified population and a landscape that was already being rewritten by the sword. The march resumed as the first shadows of evening stretched over the broken port. There were no victory feasts. The soldiers moved with a grim, silent intensity, their boots creating a rhythmic thud that shook the foundations of the nearby ruins. Every mile gained was a mile closer to the ultimate humiliation of the Christian world. The logistical miracle of the sea pincer had provided everything: fresh troops, unlimited supplies, and a clear path. The scale of the disaster was just beginning to dawn on the northern kingdoms. The crusade of Al-Mansur was no longer a raid, it was an eclipse. The mountains of Galicia did not offer sanctuary, they became a graveyard. After the fall of Oporto, Al-Mansur did not allow his troops a single night of rest. The combined force of 25,000 men moved like a singular iron-scaled serpent through the jagged peaks. The sun of mid-August was a relentless hammer, but the discipline of the Cordoba Caliphate was harder than the stone beneath their boots. Every 5 miles, a fresh scouting party was launched into the brush, ensuring that no Christian ambush could take root. The strategy was simple: speed, terror, and the total eradication of any obstacle. The army didn't follow the roads. They carved new ones through the blood of those who dared to stand in their way. 15 minutes of delay was considered a failure. 30 minutes was a crime. Al-Mansur rode at the very front, his presence pushing the pace to the absolute limit of human endurance. The first major resistance appeared at the pass of Pena de Rey. A local count had gathered 2,000 men, hoping the narrow terrain would neutralize the Moorish cavalry. It was a fatal miscalculation. Al-Mansur didn't charge the center. He deployed his mountain-specialized Berber light infantry to the ridges above, moving with the silence of shadows. Before the Christian bells could sound the alarm, a rain of blackened arrows and naphtha pots descended from the cliffs. The pass became a furnace. The cavalry then struck the panicked survivors, turning the retreat into a 3-mile-long slaughter. There was no mercy for the wounded. The logic of the campaign dictated that no enemy should be left behind to strike from the rear. The bodies were left where they fell, a grim trail of meat and iron marking the path of the caliph's fury. The dynamics of the march were surgical. Every village encountered was a target for caloric extraction. The soldiers didn't just take food, they stripped the land bare. Grain, cattle, and horses were funneled into the baggage train with mechanical precision. If a village resisted, it was erased from the map in less than 1 hour. The speed of the destruction meant that the news of the invasion often arrived only minutes before the vanguard itself. This created a wave of psychological paralysis. 500 refugees would flee toward the next town, their stories of the army of ghosts multiplying the terror. Al-Mansur used this panic as a weapon, allowing the fear to do the work of 1,000 swords. The Christian kingdoms were not just being conquered, they were being unmade from the inside out. The terrain grew steeper, the air thinner, but the momentum only increased. The infantry units, reorganized after the sea landing, proved their worth in the rocky defiles. They moved with a rhythmic, bone-shaking thud, 1,000 boots hitting the earth in unison. The sound was audible for miles, a psychological drumbeat that announced the end of the world. In the rare moments of transition, the engineers worked on the fly, bridging mountain streams with the timber of looted churches. There were no long descriptions of the Galician forests, only the tactical utility of the trees for siege engines and firewood. Every 2 hours, the ranks were checked. Any soldier who lagged was replaced by a fresh one from the reserves. The machine never stopped. The machine never tired. As the army descended into the valley leading toward the holy city, the scale of the devastation became absolute. The landscape was a mosaic of black circles where granaries used to be. Al-Mansur's path of fury was designed to ensure that Santiago de Compostela would have no reinforcements and no supplies. He was isolating the heart of the Christian faith. The points of reconnection in the narrative were the constant, small-scale skirmishes that erupted every few hours. A hidden archer here, a desperate peasant with a pitchfork there, each was met with a swift, lethal response that required no orders. The soldiers knew the rhythm of the purge. They moved like a tide, swallowing everything in their path. The weather turned, a sudden mountain storm lashing the columns with cold rain, but it did not slow the advance. If anything, the mud made the men more feral. The iron of their armor grew cold, but the fire of the campaign burned hotter. Al-Mansur viewed the storm as a test from the heavens, pushing his captains to double the pace. 12 miles a day became 18. The logistics remained flawless, a miracle of administration that kept 25,000 mouths fed in a scorched wasteland. This was the peak of the 10th century warfare, a total mobilization of resources, technology, and religious zeal. The Christians, trapped in their feudal silos, could not comprehend an enemy that moved with such administrative perfection. By the evening of the 3rd day in the mountains, the vanguard reached the heights of the last ridge. Below them lay the final approach to the sanctuary of St. James. The sight was not met with prayers or speeches, but with the cold, methodical preparation of weapons. The soldiers didn't look at the beauty of the distant spires. They looked at the thickness of the walls and the placement of the gates. The tension reached a breaking point. The transition from the march to the siege was a matter of minutes. The heavy cavalry began to fan out into the plains, cutting off all escape routes. The pincer that had started in the Atlantic was now closing its iron teeth around the very soul of the Reconquista. Al-Mansur stood on the edge of the cliff, his silhouette a dark omen against the gray sky. He didn't need to speak to his generals. The plan was etched into their minds. The destruction of Viseu, the landing at Oporto, and the path of fury had all been movements in a grand symphony of humiliation. Every 10 minutes, a new unit arrived at the assembly point, taking its place with the silence of a well-oiled gear. fear. The ground beneath the holy city began to vibrate as the heavy siege wagons were brought forward. There would be no negotiations. There would be no ransoms. The logic of the campaign was moving toward its most violent conclusion. The final surge began under the cover of the fading light. The archers moved into position, their quivers filled with incendiary bolts. The engineers began the assembly of the great rams, built from the oaks of the very forests they had just leveled. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of wet earth, cold steel, and the impending death of an era. The Christian defenders inside the walls could hear the rhythmic chanting of the thousands outside, a sound that promised no tomorrow. The scale of the coming battle was unprecedented. This was the moment where history would be broken, and Al-Mansur was the hammer. As the first fires were lit in the siege camps, the reality of the situation settled over the region. The holy city was alone. The kings of Leon and Navarre were too far, too slow, and too afraid. The path of fury had effectively severed the head of the Christian defense from its body. The final transition was near. The soldiers checked their gear one last time, the metallic clicks echoing through the valley like the ticking of a doomsday clock. The countdown to 11th August had reached its final hour. The pride of the West was about to meet the iron of the South in a collision that would echo for 1,000 years. The last scouts returned from the city perimeter, reporting that the main gates were barred and the walls were manned by monks and a skeleton garrison of knights. Al-Mansur smiled, a thin, predatory expression. He didn't want a fair fight. He wanted a demonstration of power. The army was ready. The logistics were secure. The path was clear. Every 5 minutes, the tension grew until it was a physical weight in the air. The order was given in a whisper that traveled through the ranks like a lightning strike. The first catapult swung into motion, the heavy stone whistling through the air as the first blow was struck against the sanctuary. The impact was the signal for the total assault. The infantry surged forward, not in a chaotic rush, but in disciplined waves. The path of fury had reached its destination. There was no more land to conquer, only a symbol to destroy. The sky over Santiago began to glow with a sickly orange light as the first roofs caught fire. The transition was complete. The march was over. The slaughter had begun. The bells of the cathedral began to ring, a frantic, desperate sound that would soon be silenced forever by the weight of Al-Mansur's ambition. The gates groaned under the first impact of the ram. The morning of 11th August, 997, arrived with the sound of snapping timber and the roar of 20 heavy catapults. Al-Mansur did not believe in the sanctity of stone. He believed in the gravity of iron. The first volley of 50-kilogram rocks hit the northern battlements of Santiago de Compostela at exactly 6 a.m. The vibration was so intense that it cracked the stained glass in the cathedral's nave 300 meters away. This was not a siege designed to starve the enemy. It was a surgical strike to decapitate the Christian faith. Every 3 minutes, another wave of stones and naphtha-soaked fireballs arced over the walls, turning the city's defenses into a jagged line of smoke and screams. The local militia, paralyzed by the sheer scale of the bombardment, watched as their ancient fortifications began to melt under the heat and the impact. Al-Mansur's infantry moved in absolute silence. 1,000 men, organized into interlocking tortoise formations, advanced toward the breach. They didn't run. They marched with a rhythmic, bone-shaking thud that echoed through the valley. The arrows from the walls were useless. They skittered off the bronze shields like dry rain. The dynamic was chilling. The closer the army got, the quieter the city became. By 9 a.m., the central gate, reinforced with iron and 2 centuries of history, disintegrated under the rhythmic pounding of the great ram. The sound of the splintering oak was the signal for the total surge. The vanguard, composed of elite Berber shock troops, poured into the breach like a flood of blackened steel. The street fighting was a calculated massacre. Al-Mansur did not want a prolonged battle. He wanted a demonstration. Every alleyway was cleared with a 3-man tactical cell, a shield-bearer, a spearman, and a crossbowman. There were no long descriptions of heroism, only the cold reality of physics. 15 minutes after the breach, the main plaza was a lake of red. The cobblestones, polished by generations of pilgrims, grew slick with the blood of 2,000 defenders who died where they stood. The speed of the takeover was designed to prevent the burning of the city's treasures. Al-Mansur wanted the spoils intact. He rode through the gates on his black stallion, his face a mask of iron, moving directly toward the cathedral. The final obstacle was the cathedral's grand portal. 50 knights had barricaded themselves inside, swearing to die for the apostle. Al-Mansur didn't negotiate. He ordered his engineers to use the very same rams that had broken the city gates. The sound of the heavy wood meeting the sacred doors was a rhythmic doomsday clock. Every 10 seconds, thud, the hinges groaned. Every 20 seconds, thud, the stone archway cracked. When the doors finally exploded inward, the soldiers didn't enter with a shout. They entered with the chilling discipline of an inventory crew. The knights were cut down in a 5-minute frenzy of steel, their blood splashing across the golden altar. The transition was complete. The sanctuary was now a warehouse. The extraction of wealth began at 11:30 a.m. Al-Mansur sat on a folding chair in the center of the nave, watching the systematic dismantling of the West's most sacred site. Special units of treasure handlers moved with mechanical precision. They stripped 200 kilograms of gold leaf from the altars. They packed 500 silver vessels into padded crates. Every 10 minutes, a new wagon was loaded and sent toward the southern gate. The speed was a logistical miracle. There was no looting for personal gain. Everything belonged to the Caliphate. The soldiers didn't even look at the captives. They only looked at the weight of the gold. The silence inside the cathedral was broken only by the scraping of saws and the heavy breathing of men carrying the weight of an empire. Then came the act that would haunt Europe for centuries. Al-Mansur pointed his sword at the great bells. These were not just instruments of music. They were the heartbeat of Galicia. It took 100 men and a system of heavy pulleys to lower them from the towers. They were placed on the shoulders of the surviving Christian captives. This was the peak of the humiliation. The bells would not be melted. They would be carried 800 miles to Cordoba to serve as oil lamps in a mosque. The psychological impact was a physical weight. As the bells hit the dirt of the plaza, the last spirit of the resistance broke. 11th of August was not just a date of conquest. It was the date the Christian world lost its voice. By 3 p.m. the city was hollow. The fires were being put out by the Moorish engineers, not to save the city, but to ensure the smoke didn't choke the transport lines. The logistics of the retreat were already being calculated. Al-Mansur ordered the total destruction of the outer walls. Using a technique of undermining, the engineers collapsed the main towers into piles of rubble in less than 2 hours. Santiago was left as an open city, a skeleton of stone that could never be defended again. The scale of the ruin was visible from the peaks of the surrounding mountains, where the few survivors watched the systematic erasure of their world. The transition from the assault to the departure was seamless. At 5 p.m., the first column of the heavy baggage train began to move south. They didn't leave as a tired army, but as a revitalized machine. Behind them, the cathedral stood empty, its treasures gone, its bells silent, its altar stained. Al-Mansur stayed until the very last wagon cleared the square. He didn't offer a prayer or a speech. He merely wiped the dust from his gloves and mounted his horse. The assault on the sanctuary was a closed chapter in a book of blood. The road back was long, but they carried the heart of the north with them. The final image of part 4 is the sight of the great bells moving slowly out of the city gates, draped in black cloth, balanced on the backs of the weeping nobility. The sound of the metal dragging against the gravel was a harsh, rhythmic scraping that replaced the holy music of the morning. Every 5 minutes the whip cracked, keeping the pace. The pride of the Reconquista was being dragged into the dust. The 11th of August was ending, but the nightmare for the Christian kings was only beginning. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the army disappeared into the smoke-filled horizon. The march from Santiago de Compostela back to Cordoba was not a retreat. It was a slow-motion victory parade, designed to bleed the Christian spirit dry. The column stretched for 15 miles, a glittering serpent of steel, gold, and human misery. At the heart of this procession were the great bells, the ultimate trophies of the 11th of August. Weighing thousands of kilograms, they were suspended on massive wooden beams, their heavy bronze rims scraping the dust of the Galician roads. Beneath them, 500 Christian captives, including former knights and high-ranking clerics, were harnessed like beasts of burden. Every 10 minutes, the cracking of the Berber whips signaled a change in the human yoke. There was no rest. Al-Mansur demanded a pace of 15 miles a day, regardless of the heat or the steepness of the mountain passes. The logistics of moving such a massive amount of loot required surgical precision. Behind the bells came 400 wagons loaded with the silver, gold, and silken tapestries of the north. Every crate was numbered and guarded by a 10-man unit of heavy cavalry. The dynamic was chillingly efficient. While the captives starved, the Moorish army was fed by the very land they had just destroyed. The cattle seized from the Galician valleys provided a constant supply of meat, and the grain from looted monasteries was baked into bread at every night camp. The humiliation was not just a theme, it was a physical reality. The captives were forced to witness their own holy relics being used as everyday stools by the camp guards. The transition through the mountain passes of Leon was a grueling test of Al-Mansur's administrative genius. The path was narrow, and the weight of the bells threatened to pull the carriers into the ravines. Engineers worked 1 hour ahead of the main column, leveling the ground and shoring up bridges with the timber of destroyed villages. Every 2 hours, a head count was conducted. Those who collapsed were not given water. They were replaced by fresh prisoners from the back of the line and left where they fell. The trail of the damned was marked by a literal path of discarded humans and broken wood. Al-Mansur rode at the rear, ensuring that the sight of the retreating army remained a terrifying memory for any local lords watching from the heights. The psychological warfare was as sharp as the scimitars. As the army entered the central plains, Al-Mansur ordered the bells to be struck once every hour. The deep, discordant boom echoed for miles, informing the surrounding territories that their god's voice was now a prisoner of the Caliph. This was the great humiliation. The news of the bells' journey traveled faster than the army itself, reaching the courts of Leon and Navarre like a death sentence. The kings of the north were paralyzed. To attack the column was to risk the immediate execution of the nobility held in the baggage train. Al-Mansur was not just carrying bronze, he was carrying the dignity of an entire religion, and he knew it. Every 5 miles, the column passed a milestone of destruction. Villages that had once been prosperous were now ghost towns, their wells poisoned or filled with rubble. The army moved with a rhythmic, bone-shaking thud, the sound of 2,000 boots hitting the dry earth in unison. There was no dialogue between the captors and the captives. The only language was the whip and the rhythmic chanting of the Moorish soldiers. The heat of late August became a weapon in itself. The iron of the armor grew hot enough to blister skin, yet the formation never broke. Discipline was the glue that held this 800-mile-long machine together. The extraction of value continued even during the march. Special units of scribes sat on the moving wagons, documenting every item for the caliph's treasury in Cordoba. This was a bureaucratic conquest. 300 kilograms of gold leaf, 1,200 consecrated vessels, 5,000 units of livestock. The numbers were staggering. Al-Mansur used the march to reorganize his forces, sending fast-moving detachments to strike at nearby forts that had remained untouched during the initial surge. This ensured that the return journey was not a moment of weakness, but a second wave of terror. No one was safe until the banners of Cordoba vanished over the southern horizon. By the time the column reached the borders of the Caliphate, the captives were shadows of men. Their feet were bloodied, their spirits crushed by the constant sight of the bells. The transition from the Christian north to the Moorish south was marked by the change in the architecture and the smell of the air. The smell of pine and cold stone was replaced by jasmine and orange blossoms. For the victors, it was the scent of home. For the prisoners, it was the scent of a permanent cage. The pace of the march actually increased as they hit the paved Roman roads leading to the capital. The efficiency of the Roman infrastructure was repurposed for the glory of Al-Mansur. The scale of the spoils was so vast that it changed the economy of the region. The value of silver dropped in the local markets as the wagons began to unload their cargo at the border outposts. But the bells remained the focal point. They were the physical evidence of Al-Mansur's claim to be the defender of the faith. As they crossed the final bridge toward the heart of Al-Andalus, the army was met by cheering crowds. The humiliation of the north was the celebration of the south, The bells were no longer just bells. They were the trophies of a civilization that had proven its absolute dominance. The final night of the march was spent just 10 miles from the gates of Cordoba. Al-Mansur gave the order to polish the armor and clean the banners. He wanted the entrance to be a spectacle of terrifying beauty. The captives were given a single cup of water and told to prepare for their final walk. The transition from the trail to the triumph was only hours away. The 800-mile journey was nearing its end, and the great bells were about to find their new, permanent home in the shadows of the great mosque. The nightmare of the march was over, but the reality of the servitude was just beginning. As the first light of the next day touched the spires of Cordoba, the column began its final movement. The rhythm of the march changed to a slow, ceremonial beat. The bells were draped in white silk, a mocking contrast to the grime and blood of the men carrying them. Every 5 minutes a silver trumpet sounded, announcing the arrival of the greatest spoils in the history of the peninsula. The city gates opened wide, and the trail of the damned reached its destination. The pride of Santiago was now a floor decoration for the Caliph. The gates of Cordoba groaned under the weight of a triumph that felt like the end of history. 800 miles of dust and blood culminated in a single blinding moment as the great bells of Santiago entered the capital. Al-Mansur rode at the head of a column that seemed to have no end, greeted by the roar of 500,000 citizens. For the Christian captives, this was the final circle of hell. The bells, once the sacred voice of their world, were now nothing more than massive bronze trophies dragged through the dirt. The air was thick with the scent of ambergris and the deafening beat of 1,000 drums. The destination was the great mosque. Al-Mansur did not order a feast, he ordered immediate labor. The bells were not placed on pedestals, but were inverted. In a move of calculated humiliation, the bells of St. James were repurposed as massive oil lamps. 500 liters of olive oil were poured into the bronze hollows that had once rung for Christian prayer. The transition was absolute. The object that once called the North to arms now illuminated the prayers of the South. Every 10 minutes, a new lamp was lit, casting long shadows of Moorish arches across the faces of broken knights. The distribution of spoils was a bureaucratic masterpiece. 400 wagons were unloaded in less than 6 hours. Gold leaf from the Santiago altar was melted into 1,000 dinars, entering the Cordoban economy instantly. Silken tapestries were cut into prayer rugs. Al-Mansur's philosophy was total erasure. He wanted the Christian world to look at their empty shrines and feel a void that no prayer could fill. The dynamic of the Reconquista had been reversed for a generation. The gleam of Cordoba was now fueled by the literal light of the stolen north. Inside the mosque, the air was cool and dark, lit only by the inverted bronze. There was no dialogue. The scale of the victory left no room for words. The soldiers who breached the walls of Santiago were now the administrators of a new, expanded border. Al-Mansur walked through the columns, checking the oil levels with the cold precision of a merchant. To him, 11th of August was simply a successful operation. He had stolen a future. The bells would remain here for 2 centuries, a heavy, silent reminder of the day the North was broken. The end was not a speech, but a sudden cessation of movement. The last wagon was emptied. The last captive was branded and sent to the quarries. The rhythmic thud of the march was replaced by the quiet flickering of the oil. The world had changed, and the change was permanent. Al-Mansur stepped out into the white light of the courtyard. He looked at his hands, stained with the ink of new tax decrees. He had unmade a world in less than a month. The logistics of terror had proven superior to the walls of faith. The city of Cordoba slept bathed in the soft, stolen glow of Galician bronze. The bells did not ring that night. They never rang again. Everything the Christians had built was gone.